pleasantly surprised to see the turnout, and maybe I shouldn't be. This is a critical issue.
My name is Representative Kathleen James. I represent the Bennington 4 district of Manchester, Arlington, Sandgate, and part of Sunderland. And I fairly recently have been elected to the leadership team of the Climate Solutions Caucus. I am one of the House Vice Chairs. There are two of us. We wanted to bring everyone together tonight to give you a little bit of an overview about the work that the caucus has been doing. We are a nonpartisan caucus with 83 members at the moment. The members belong to both the Vermont House and the Senate. And we're a group of legislators that are all committed to climate action. We meet weekly when the legislature is in session up in the State House. And those meetings are open to the public. Anyone is invited to attend. And you can hear us talking about bills, and we oftentimes have very interesting presentations too on different policy initiatives. The caucus met shortly after we adjourned in May. 40 of us came back together in Montpelier to make a strategy for the 2020 session. We had an all-day planning meeting. And following that planning meeting, we broke into 4 summer work groups. And the work groups covered transportation, building or thermal efficiency, green economy, and messaging and communications. That's funny. That was the work group I couldn't remember. That's the one I'm on. We have been busy over the summer, I promise you. The work groups each met over the summer pretty regularly. Many of the work groups met multiple times. Some of them took testimony and heard from a wide variety of stakeholders. And in early September, they submitted their policy recommendations, their legislative ideas, to the leadership team. That work was used to develop a platform, or basically a collection of banner bills that we hope to advance during the 2020 session. And to hear about those banner bills and those ideas, we're very fortunate tonight. I'm going to introduce her now, but she's not quite up yet. Very fortunate tonight to have Representative Sara Copeland is here. She drove down from Bradford. She is the House Chair of the Climate Solutions Caucus and also the chair of the House Government Operations Committee. So she'll be talking in a moment about those banner bills that we'll be working on in 2020. I'm also joined tonight by my fellow caucus members, Representative David Durfee from Bennington 3 and Senator Brian Campion. So that is it for me for the moment. I'm going to turn the mic over to David, and he'll talk a little bit more about the caucus and our summer work.
Good, thank you. Hi, everybody. This feels a little awkward, holding this microphone.
There you go.
This way. And thank you, Kathleen, for the introduction. And just looking around the room here, I'm surprised and pleasantly surprised to see the turnout. And maybe I shouldn't be. This is a critical issue, and your being here sends a message, I think, to us and to anybody who might be watching on television that it's not just the 4 of us who feel this way. I do from time to time hear people saying this is an issue, this is a global issue, it's a national issue. Why is Vermont, why should Shaftesbury be dealing with it? And I think we all understand that we each have an important part to play. This summer I spent some time in one of the groups that Kathleen mentioned, the Green Economy Group, and then more recently I've been working with a small group of legislators coming up with guiding principles for any legislation, any proposals that we might have this session. And it's a work still in progress, but essentially we're looking at a couple of things. One is we understand that there will be in transition to the next phase of our lives here. There will be costs, and we want to be sure that those costs are not borne by those who are least able to afford it. So we'll be making sure that that is stressed. We also want to make sure that the views of everyone are taken into account, including those who are likely to be most impacted by any changes. So I'm sure we'll be happy to entertain questions before we're done this evening, and if there are questions about any of that, I'll be happy to try and address them. I'm going to turn it over to Senator Campion at this point.
Thanks.
Forgot to say one thing, I'm sorry. If you could hold your questions to the end, we're going to have a Q&A session after the presentation. Thanks.
I just want to echo my appreciation for everyone being here. It's a great crowd, great turnout, incredibly important topic, and special thanks to my House colleagues for including me on this. I serve on the Natural Resources and Energy Committee, so any questions regarding what the Senate may or may not do around any of these kinds of policies, I'm happy to take those, as well as just say a few words about where things stand with Act 250. Kathleen, you're looking at me. Is this working okay? Okay. So many of you know that Act 250 is Vermont's land use policy. We are approaching the 50th anniversary of Act 250. So starting last summer, many of us took a road show. Many of us, you may recall, were in Manchester talking to people around some of the strengths around Act 250, some of the weaknesses. I think in general, most Vermonters agree that one of the reasons this state is so beautiful is because Act 250 came into play, again, roughly 50 years ago, to limit the amount of sprawl, to really focus on keeping villages small and condensed. And now what we're looking to do, in addition to getting a sense from people some of the strengths and weaknesses, we are incorporating issues related to climate change into Act 250, which of course have to do with how buildings are built, energy efficiency, the kind of construction that's used, transportation issues, etc. So I'm happy to elaborate on any of those this evening, but I did want to give folks an opportunity to maybe weigh in a little bit on Act 250 as it relates to climate change. I'll just say one other thing about the process. We're still in the bill form, so there is no actual legislation that has been passed. The House is working hard on taking a look at our recommendations, and they'll likely pass us a bill in January that we'll get working on. And then secondly, I also brought with me, and I'll leave these or pass them around, some of the accomplishments that both everybody here as well as Senate colleagues worked on this year as it relates to clean water, the environment, and climate change. So with that, I will turn it over to Representative Sara Copeland.
Take it away.
That's cute how we get to pass this down the row. I'm going to try clipping it here and see if that works. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. That's better.
Not as fuzzy as it was before.
All right. Thank you so much for coming out on a cold, dark night. I hope that you stoked the fire well before you left home, because it seems like it's going to be pretty chilly in the wee hours of the night. Coming down here, though, I did notice that you didn't get as much snow as we did back in Bradford, so be happy about that, because we've had a couple rounds of plowing already. So thank you all for coming out to engage with us. We're taking this presentation on the road around the state. We're going to attempt to get to every single county, get to as many towns as we can find folks who are interested in having us. Because we know that Vermont's answer to the climate challenges needs to work for Vermonters, and in order for us to feel comfortable about that, we need to share with you before January what we're planning to present for our priorities in January. And so I'm very thankful that you're here, and I hope that you will be able to stay and engage with us during the Q&A after I share with you a few of the Climate Solutions Caucus priorities. As you heard, we've got a number of legislators from all over the state, from big towns, from small towns, from cities, from countryside, all really engaged in figuring out what Vermont's answer to this climate emergency is going to be. There's a number of reasons why different folks come with the passion about climate, and I know that you've probably talked some with your local reps about that. But across the board, the common motivating factor for folks in the Climate Solutions Caucus is a frustration that even though we've staked our claim and said that we will reduce our use of fossil fuels, we've done that under Republican Governor Jim Douglas, reaffirmed that under a Democratic Governor Shumlin, was reaffirmed again under a Republican Governor Phil Scott. Even though we have, by and large, seen unanimity about the fact that we should reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, we have not yet put in place measures to tackle the problem in a meaningful way. We have done a great job of tackling that problem in our electric sector through an interstate compact known as RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. So in our electric sector, we are getting off of fossil fuel burning electric sources. But right now, as is the case for a lot of rural states and cold climate states, our transportation and our heating sectors are where we're burning the most fossil fuels. And so some focus and attention on how we help Vermonters make that transition is in order. Why do we want to make that transition? Well, because shifting over to the electrification of heating and transportation is actually, not only is it cleaner, so it's better for your health and better for the health of all of the folks in our area, but it's also cheaper because the total cost of ownership for many of these electrical technologies is lower than your traditional internal combustion engine or oil heating source. And we know that Vermonters spend about $2 billion a year on fossil fuels, and 80% of that goes right out the state and into the bank accounts of the folks who own the fossil fuel companies. And we know that if we shift over some or all of that, we will be keeping some of that $1.8 billion in the state of Vermont, creating jobs here in Vermont and leaving money in the pockets of Vermont families because they didn't have to spend it on the expensive gasoline or heating oil. So we want to focus on the fact that it's not only is it good for the environment, but it's actually good for our economy as well to make these investments. So the Climate Solutions Caucus, as you've heard, has had a robust work session this past summer and fall. And now we are taking our 4 banner bills on the road and looking for input and looking for help from Vermonters to pass this agenda. The agenda has 4 main pillars. The first one being accountability. We are currently blowing through and completely missing every one of our greenhouse gas reduction targets, the ones that were set in place during the Douglas administration, the Shumlin administration, as well as the Scott administration. So we know that we need some form of accountability, and that proposal will be to pass a Global Warming Solutions Act. And the Global Warming Solutions Act is modeled after a bill that's been in place in Massachusetts for a decade. It has helped them spur a lot of innovation in how to transition their transportation and heating technologies over to electrification. But we will also be borrowing from New York and Maine because New York just passed their Global Warming Solutions Act in 2019, as did Maine. And so we want to take a look at, how they did it differently and borrow from their good ideas. It is a strategy to focus every single state agency on cutting pollution. It's going to be important because we need to take our aspirations that we've been missing, that we've not been reaching, and we need to put them into statute as requirements so that everybody has to come to the table and help figure out how to make this happen. And this accountability measure is really foundational to many of the other things that will also need to come in future years. So the accountability in the Global Warming Solutions Act is going to be key to future work that we do. The other recommendation of these summer work groups was to support the passage of the Transportation and Climate Initiative. Anybody familiar with what Transportation and Climate Initiative is? It's called TCI. Okay, a few of you have heard of it. Great. So this is 12 states plus Washington, D.C. So 13 jurisdictions in the northeastern part of the United States are getting together to create a RGGI program. Remember I talked about RGGI, that's what has helped us to decarbonize our electricity grid. The TCI program would do the same thing for transportation fuels. And so it would be a cap and trade system that the entire region would enter into. These negotiations are being done by the governors of all of these different jurisdictions, and we expect a recommendation will come to the legislature at some point in December or January, because the TCI program will be moving forward at that point. We want to make sure that if Vermont is joining, actually what I should say is Vermont will join TCI if it happens regionally, because it makes no sense for us not to, because we would be paying the price of the cap and trade system but not getting any of the benefit of it. When we talk about our principles around how to spend that money, though, we want to make sure that we're not using proceeds from a cap and invest system to pave roads and build bridges. We want to continue to fund our transportation infrastructure in the way it's always been funded. And TCI revenue should be used to invest in helping Vermonters find non-gasoline powered ways of getting around. So whether that's investing in public transit so that we have a more robust bus system around the state, whether it means investing in electric bike or electric vehicle incentives so that people can get off of fossil fuels as much as possible for their commutes around town. And we want to make sure also that we look at best practices from some of these other jurisdictions about how to accelerate the impact of these investments. For instance, Charlie Baker, who's the governor of Massachusetts, is recommending that Massachusetts should consider bonding and using a bigger bucket of money up front to speed up some of these investments, and then that bond would be paid out over time with proceeds from the cap and invest system. So TCI is on the move, and the Climate Solutions Caucus recommends that we support it and that we look for ways to accelerate. The third recommendation from the summer work groups came in the thermal efficiency and heating sector. We know that Vermont is a chilly state and that it costs us a lot of money at times to heat our homes. We also know that the cheapest kilowatt of electricity or gallon of heating oil is the one that you didn't need to buy because you've weatherized your home. And we know that we need to do a better job of weatherization. In order to help Vermonters understand what those best practices are for keeping our homes efficient, we want to make sure that we're doing a better job of getting information out to the professionals who are working on our homes about what our building codes are, and also about what the new technologies are that people might want to use to replace maybe their 30-year-old oil boiler. And so a lot of what's going to happen in this area, I think, for this year is about workforce development. It's about making sure that plumbing contractors, electricians, builders all have access to some of this up-to-date information and professional development so that they can be offering Vermonters the most up-to-date and efficient heating sources for their homes, and also best practices in weatherizing our buildings. There are a lot of people who we come into contact with when we're buying or selling a home. People who you might not think of as having a direct impact in climate issues. Your realtors, your appraisers, bank loans that have certain checklists that they use in order to issue a mortgage. We want to make sure that those parts of the workforce are also in alignment, so that there is value in weatherizing your home, and not only the value in slapping on a clean coat of paint when you go to try to sell your home. And so workforce development will be kind of across the board to help all of Vermont kind of pull in the same direction. The last recommendation of the summer work groups is around beneficial electrification. Okay, so this is taking another look at our renewable energy standard, making sure that as we are using more electricity because more people are plugging in their car or more people are using a cold climate heat pump to heat their homes, that electricity is being generated renewable in-state generation. Because we know that not only improves our energy security, because we know where our energy is coming from, but it also creates jobs. And I know that there are people in the audience who can talk about the job creation that happens when we spur more renewable energy generation in state. We need to make sure that we are streamlining the incentives for the low carbon technologies. So by that I mean, if you go to a car dealership and you want to buy an electric vehicle and you want to access some of those incentives that are in place, what's the first thing that the car dealership needs to ask you? They need to ask you who your electric utility is, so that they can look on a chart and see which electric utility is offering which incentive. We need to streamline that, right? It should be much easier. And there are some really great ideas out there about how to streamline those incentives. And one of the ways would be for us to transition to an all fuels efficiency model. If you remember back when RGGI was first created, what Vermont did with our RGGI money is we helped to create the Efficiency Vermont program, which, as you know, has been really critical in helping folks reduce their electricity use over time, and has been a very good ambassador of the new technologies that we need to use in that realm. If we can have an Efficiency Vermont focused on carbon reduction, focused on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions, then that could be that one-stop shopping that would help Vermonters access the information they need to make that transition. So an all fuels efficiency utility would be a good way to do that. So that's a quick run through of the 4 main priorities. So accountability, workforce development, particularly around thermal efficiency, electrification of everything, and making sure that we use our TCI revenues to clean up our transportation sector. At this point, I think we can probably do questions.
Yeah.
Q&A. And I don't know if are you calling on people when you see hands, or are we going to ask?
I think Kathy has the mic.
If you want to raise your hand, I'll come to you and be asked to speak to the mic. We'll catch you if you go.
Gotcha.
Sounds good. So we are open for questions.
Hi there, Trixie Zen, Sunderland, Select Board. Question on reduction of the gasoline usage. Where are the revenues going to come to fix our roads if everyone's driving an electric car?
That's a great question. And that's a question that's being worked on right now. The Public Utilities Commission is tasked right now with looking at a number of different ways of using a small electric surcharge to fund transportation infrastructure in the way that we all pay into a gas tax right now with our gasoline-powered engines. So that is in process. There's a number of different ways that we could do it, but nobody has come up with the quick and easy answer yet. So stay tuned, but we do recognize that we want everybody who's using the roads to be paying their fair share.
Hi, I'm Barbara from Arlington, and I want to know, you said something about using more electricity for cars and other things. instead of gas and propane and everything else. Well, our electric bills go up in the wintertime here, like double. So how are we supposed to pay for that? And how, I don't see that happening. I really don't. Because I noticed when I lived up near Stratton, people's electric bills went double in the wintertime, starting in probably, I don't even know, October, maybe November, till almost April. That's a lot to pay for. And you have an older generation coming up that's taking over. And how are we supposed to heat our places with the money that we get from Social Security that may be cut? Exactly how do you propose to do that and drive around, and where's that? If you plug into something, do you have to pay for it? So wherever you plug in?
For an electric vehicle, certainly?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
If we did change to them.
So I would recommend anybody who is seeing a doubling of their electric bill in the wintertime to have a home energy audit, and that's something that that your electric utility or Efficiency Vermont can do for you. But the really cool thing about some of the new technologies is that they're not heating with electricity the way your old school, plug in the wall with the coils that glow. It's not that kind of electricity use. It's basically, it's running a small compressor and some fans to create heat, to extract the heat in the same way that the backside of your refrigerator puts off heat. So it's that sort of compression and blowing heat in that way. It uses much less electricity than you would think from the old school electric heaters, and in that way it's much more efficient.
But what about all the old farmhouses that are drafty and people are trying to do their best to upgrade?
So
And
we
what
made some
about-
investments in weatherization to help Vermonters weatherize their homes. I think ideally what we should have is a sustained funding source for weatherization, so that if you're on the low income end of the spectrum, you might be able to get a full grant to help weatherize your home. If you're on the high end of the spectrum, maybe you can just access an easy loan, and then some sort of transition in between, so that people who are middle income could maybe get some grant and some loan to weatherize their home. The fact of the matter is that we have not had building codes that are enforced ever in this state. And that's why we have housing stock that's cold and drafty, and maybe it was built 200 years ago when nobody had an inkling that building codes were a good idea. But the fact is, when we invest in weatherizing, that money stays in our communities, because that money pays for your neighbor down the street who's a contractor who comes and does the work on your house. And then he's able to, buy basketball shoes for his daughter, and all of that money is staying in our own community. So we definitely get a bigger bang when we invest in weatherization.
Have you ever driven an electric car?
I just wanted to
Does it
add,
get up the mountains when in the snow? Absolutely. It has
I
enough
just-
power to get up?
Yes.
I just wanted to add,
Necessarily fund weatherization, because that would be cross-subsidized.
Ready?
Yeah.
My name is Kathy, and I'm from Sandgate, and I have a question about the electric cars. I've read that in the winter, when they get brutally cold like now, some of the gel in the batteries or the liquid just doesn't operate. And also, if that's the case, then certain areas will be kind of without their vehicles in certain times of the year. And also, I have a serious concern about the power grid, because there's even international worry about terrorist nations who are coming into our country, and they have actually taken out some power stations. And so if that happens, the state would stop if you're all on electric. So I think perhaps in the summer, an electric vehicle might be good and, power driven, or if people want to keep their fossil fuel vehicles, I think they should certainly be able to do that.
Yeah. So just for a quick show of hands, how many people here drive a hybrid vehicle? So one that has both gas and electric? And how many people here drive a full electric vehicle? Okay, so you've got a lot of neighbors that you can ask about how their electric vehicle is working for them. And as to your concerns about sabotage of our electric grid, all the more reason we should be promoting local renewable energy generation and storage here in state so that we have our energy independence, because it's a big wide world out there and who knows what's going to happen.
Hi, my name is Mary Pat from Paulette, and when you said all these different initiatives and you mentioned for the state agencies, so right now is your plan really looking at converting over your buildings, your municipal buildings and your police stations, or what exactly did you mean by the state agencies?
Oh, so when I talked about state agencies, I talked about the fact that all of our state agencies should be pushing us to be moving in the right direction, in the same direction. In terms of building efficiency, though, for schools and municipal buildings and, you know, town halls and police departments, fire departments, we've got some really great ideas about how we might be able to accelerate the pace at which we are weatherizing those buildings and making them more efficient. Because right now we have a program in state that that allows the state to evaluate the energy use of a building and consider how much savings they could get over the course of 7 or 10 years. And then they can borrow that money up front and do the weatherization that will pay off in 10 years. And then after that, it's, it's lowering the tax burden for all of us because our buildings are more efficient. What we'd like to do is figure out a way to extend that program to all of our cities and towns as well, because you know that your town garage, probably leaks like a sieve, and you got to keep the fire trucks ready to go in a somewhat warm building. We should be doing that sort of a bonding program for municipalities as well, and that's definitely an idea that we're trying to figure out how to promote.
If I could also add this year, transportation and appropriations require that state vehicles increase the numbers in terms of electric vehicles pretty significantly. So hopefully that will also help make a difference.
Jim, did you have a question?
My name is Bruce Lehrman from Bennington. I have a question about the power grid as well, although not the same as was asked before. It's my understanding that our generation and transmission of renewables is already being constrained by the grid network that we have now. Is there any part of your legislative package that would address grid improvement, including smart grid?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I didn't want to get too far down into the weeds because I think I'd probably talk beyond what I understand about how that's all going to work, but also put you to sleep because you'd be bored to tears. But yes, you're absolutely right. We do, our grid system was built at a time when most of our electric power came from big power generating stations and radiated out from there. And what you're referring to and what we need to be transitioning to is more of a distributed generation system where your energy is being generated either on your rooftop or close by through some sort of community wind or community solar. And that does put constraints on the grid. And we do have a lot of little utilities in Vermont. We do have one giant utility, but there are also a lot of small municipal utilities, and we need to make sure that when we're making these changes in our policy that we make sure that it works for the big utility as well as for the little utility. So, yes.
Kathy, we had a question up here.
Thank you. My name is Jim Sullivan. I'm with the Regional Planning Commission in Bennington County. And I just wanted to mention up front that the regional planning commissions have developed regional energy plans, as I'm sure you know, and we've been working with towns to develop local energy plans over the last few years that contain implementation strategies that talk about a lot of the things that you're talking about. We've also been working lately, I think Madison's here, Madison Kramer's here. She worked with us to support the formation of a lot of local energy committees in towns around the region. And we've started over this past year and going on into next year working with those local energy committees and in a program with some funding from Efficiency Vermont to do a lot of outreach and education on energy implementation actions. So we've done programs on weatherization, alternative heating systems, electric vehicles, and more to come. So I just wanted to give everybody a heads up on that, that effort is going on and to pay attention because there's a lot of really good information answering, I think, a lot of the questions that people are asking and also providing information on a lot of the financial incentives that are available to folks. So that's coming up.
Jim, can anyone sign up for your newsletter? Because it's really informative.
Yeah, if anyone would like.
So don't let him slip out the door again, because he's a good resource for you.
Feel free, or you can pass along emails to me from Simons tonight, and I'll make sure people get our newsletter. I also have one wonky request for you guys. As a planner and working with our local planning partners, we're charged with tracking energy use in the different sectors, as you've discussed, and targeting our implementation actions based on how well we're doing or how well we're not doing in those sectors. And we have really good information on electricity because it's coming from a regulated utility. We do not have good information at a local or regional level on transportation and thermal fossil fuel use. That information is out there and it could be accessed. There's some political issues, but it would be enormously beneficial if we could get that information for our planning efforts.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Yep. I will put that on my list.
My name is Carol DuPont, and I do have a question. We were lucky enough to have Kathleen James with us for our last meeting, and she explained, I think you mentioned something about having 13 states involved or whatever, and that was with the, again, I could be confused, was that with the fuel distribution, that the people, basically, people that distribute fuel would be putting it out to different states depending on how much they needed or how much they thought the state should get. So basically, you'd have to know that your fuel prices will go up, and basically, it's a fuel tax. It's a carbon tax. So that's basically, if I understood everything that Kathleen explained, it goes back to the carbon tax that's wrapped a little bit differently.
So we've had a carbon tax in Vermont for over a decade through the RGGI program, Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative.
Douglas administration, right?
Yep. Jim Douglas entered into that initiative 12 years ago, I think, and it has worked well for Vermont, particularly when you look at our electric costs relative to other states in the RGGI program. We have maintained, we've been able to flatten the rate of growth of our electric rates at the same time as we've been able to reduce Vermonters' usage. And that's how we would intend to use the TCI program, which is a program that is being entered into by our Republican governor. Do you want to add something to that?
No, that's it.
John Tess from Arlington. Just curious how many more solar farms we're going to build in this state. I'm kind of dismayed every time I go to Burlington at all the solar farms that are plastered all over the landscape. And it's just really dismaying to see. We created a billboard law in 1968 to do away with those, and now we're replacing them with solar farms. And I would suggest trying to move away from building them out in open land and start covering the places that are already paved. And you talk about building codes. How about incorporating some building codes, because I've heard the excuse that you can't put them on roofs because the buildings aren't structurally up to doing that. So why not incorporate that into your building codes that they are able to? So that's all I have to say on solar farms. So, if we keep building solar farms, we might as well repeal the billboard law. The second thing, and I've always wondered about this, is that in all these years, I've never heard a single word about hydropower here in the state. We have more running water in this state. I mean, we have a lot. And the technology is there for micro hydro. You're talking about distributing the grid. Let's incorporate some of that in there. I don't understand why that, we never even hear about that word.
Yeah. So your points are taken, and I completely understand the value of infilling solar on existing buildings. I don't know if we have widely deployed either backyard hydro or backyard wind to the extent that we could be. And I think there's a lot that we still can learn about how to use the small-scale hydro and the small-scale wind in a way that could benefit us and not negatively impact the landscape.
And if I could just add, personally, I understand where you're coming from, and I respect it, but I think we all agree, I think the majority of us here agree, that we're in the middle of a crisis, and this is, just having had Veterans Day, we look at what people have sacrificed for this country. I can't speak for everyone, but I'm personally willing to sacrifice a view, and certainly some, even though, again, I like the prioritizing of, these kinds of things on rooftops and brownfields and things like that, but this is something that we're really needing to do, probably not for people even my age who are pushing 50. We'll see. We're starting to see some of the catastrophes that this is causing, but the next generation, without a doubt. And so I just feel like I have to say my piece on that.
Raise your hands nice and high so Kathy can see. Thanks. Jeff?
Thank you. Jeff Wilson, Manchester. This is, and I certainly agree with you, Brian, that this is a crisis. It is the crisis of our generation and future generations. And we have to be aggressive. It's unfortunate that we don't see that leadership on the federal level, but every one of us at the state level, local level, and individuals need to be more aggressive in trying to tackle this. I've got 6 grandchildren. I'm hoping they have grandchildren. I'd like to have them be happy and enjoy life and have the same opportunities that I've had, and I want to pass that on. So I give you a lot of credit for taking on this challenge, because it's not easy. It's an enormous, daunting challenge. You guys are stepping forward. Many of the things you are saying or may say may be politically unpopular, but I hope you have the courage to say them, and at least you are on the caucus, and that shows you've got courage just to be out in front on this issue. If you could enlighten me a little more, if you don't mind, and relative to TCI, I have I wouldn't say a good understanding, but a relatively competent understanding of cap and trade, and how that's analogous, I guess, to TCI. And when we would anticipate maybe TCI being implemented, and what type of revenue it may generate for the state. Because I do think transportation is an enormous challenge in Vermont. It's a rural state. The more people we can shift to electric cars and plug-in hybrids. I've got a plug-in hybrid. I've got it for 2 years, 107 miles per gallon because it does use some gas. It is indeed more efficient in the summertime than the wintertime, but it's one of the best investments I've ever made. But learning a little more about TCI might be helpful if you don't mind. Thank you.
Absolutely. Fellow member of the Legislative Basketball Caucus. Nice to see you, Jeff. Ex-member, yes. So TCI is the negotiations are underway right now. Please don't ask me for deep details on how the whole trading of credits is going to work, because that's probably beyond my understanding. What the timeline would say that the jurisdictions will have an agreed upon plan sometime in late 2019 or early 2020, so that the legislature in 2020, in this coming session, could pass enabling legislation that would allow Vermont to join. The program would not necessarily be up and running for probably another year and a half after that, because there's a lot of infrastructure that has to be created there to do the cap and trade. And from what I understand, just because Vermont's a small state and you can call up people in the governor's administration and say, what's TCI looking like for us? From what I understand, the annual revenue that could come into the state of Vermont would be in the range of $10 to $20 million a year, which would go a long way to investing in a more robust public transit system and helping Vermonters switch over to more efficient vehicles. Anything else you want to know?
A lot.
A lot.
They have an excellent website.
I know a guy.
Yeah.
I know a guy.
Hi, my name is John Spencer, and I want to reiterate what Jeff said. I really appreciate you guys getting in the front of this thing and standing up to people who maybe aren't as aware of climate change and so on. I have just one point to make, that the electric industry in Vermont is not in as good shape relative to carbon as you might think, because all these solutions that you hit on, electric vehicles and electric heating, rely on more electricity. And we've been fortunate, or the utilities have been fortunate, that the electric load has been going down. And it's been easy for them to meet their goals. But when it begins going up, it's going to be a lot harder. But my question to you is, has the caucus done any thinking? This goes to the ladies' discussion on costs. Have you been thinking on the costs of not doing anything, not addressing climate change?
Yes, there's definitely a great cost in inaction, and I don't pretend for a moment that just because Vermont turns the corner and starts reducing its greenhouse gas emissions, that that's somehow going to save the world. But what I know it will do is it will give other states who have larger emissions problems than we do an idea of how to do it. And that's the reason why Vermont can and should lead on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. Because other states we don't have leadership at the federal level, and so this is an experiment of the states right now. And if any state can do it, Vermont can do it, because we care and because we come out and have these community discussions together about how to do it.
Sara, if I can just follow, when you're thinking about costs and how to measure the cost, for example, of losing, the sugaring industry. How would you measure that? It goes well beyond your revenue. Just on the way up this evening, I heard that Sugarbush is selling to a multinational. Not that they're not already owned by a big company, but the reason cited was climate change, and they wouldn't be able to afford the capital that would be needed to invest in the kind of snowmaking equipment that's going to be needed here in Vermont, they're saying. So how do you measure that?
And adding the costs of health impacts like tick-borne illnesses and severe storms and flooding. So I think the cost of the cost of inaction is far higher. Another, there we go.
So I wanted to touch on the hydro question and then possibly one or two other things. My sense, we built a small hydro project 2 years ago at our farm. We're up in Danby. And we were able to do that because it was a spring, so it's groundwater, and it's not considered surface water. And my understanding why there's not developed hydro everywhere, which in a rational society I think there would be in Vermont, is that there's a lot of regulation about how the water is used in streams. So to go to the question about whether there's emergency or not, my sense is that we have an emergency with the climate. And my sense is also it's not the only emergency that we have. And it seems that there's some saying about the enemy of the good. I don't remember it exactly, but there's very well-intentioned regulation to protect riparian zones, et cetera, that get in the way of building something like small distributed hydroelectric projects. And I think what I sense happening is that you have agencies that are focused in maybe like a small area like protecting riparian zones on Vermont's streams, which are not necessarily looking at these sorts of situations in the context of we have a bigger emergency that is going to erase these habitats and ecosystems down the road possibly quicker than we think. And therefore, we're not doing what would be the most effective sort of renewable energy for our particular environmental situation. And so I would really request that you guys look at this, and specifically it's the Agency of Natural Resources that is in charge, it seems like, of regulating these kinds of projects. And they do not go forward unless they're the sort of situation we have with the spring. They just don't seem to happen on a small scale.
Yeah, we had if I may, we had a small one in Bennington. Bill Scully went through a tremendous amount of work.
It's completely crazy.
Yeah.
And this, I guess what I want to go back to that idea that we have, if we have an emergency, we need to be behaving as if we have an emergency. Otherwise, folks who don't think we have an emergency aren't going to be particularly willing to join in on doing much about it. And we really, at the regulatory level, we need to figure out how to get out of our own way, right? Stop putting hurdles up towards doing the right thing and increase incentives to do the right thing. So on a separate note, the last thing I want to say is I hear a lot of talk about energy efficiency. This is going to address aspects of climate change. And I hear a lot about renewable energy. And I just want to throw out there that at this point, science is pretty conclusive that simply reducing emissions is not sufficient to tackle the problem, right? If we want to have our future generations survive on this planet, we need to learn how to get the carbon that's in the atmosphere out of the atmosphere. And I don't think we're going to build machines that can do this efficiently. I think instead, there's a lot of very good science that indicates that soil and biomass are the most rational and expedient methods, probably the most cost-effective for drawing down carbon out of the atmosphere. And the byproducts of doing that are going to help to heal the nutrient cycle, the water cycle, and a bunch of other pressing issues. I would argue human health in this country is in a crisis state due to chronic illnesses, and these are diet related, these are nutrition related, they're toxin related, and the same things that we need to do to get the carbon out of the air are going to create better food for us to eat. And that's not really a question, sorry.
Well, if I may, Representative Durfee has a constituent by the name of McDougall, Jesse McDougall, who really has been leading the way, at least in the southern part of the state, around regenerative soil practices, which go to exactly what you're talking about. Things that you do for the soil that actually make the soil better. Of course, it helps sequester carbon. It also prepares the soil to better handle flooding. Some people, I know Jesse can share more details about this, but had Vermont started these kinds of practices a few decades ago, the impact of Hurricane Irene would not have been as severe. So I think you bring up an excellent point. I know there is a study that is happening this summer around regenerative soil practices in agriculture. I don't know if any of you want to add anything else to it, but it's an excellent, important point.
Studies due in December, and regenerative ag and soil health and the issues, the vital issues that you're talking about, have been a huge focus of our local Earth Matters group, the local 350 node. So they've been having a lot of conversation around that as well locally.
Thank you for bringing that up.
My name's Chris. Can you answer his question about state government getting out of its own way in terms of setting priorities and not being myopic when one agency is focused on things very narrowly, but we have this bigger issue? I mean, that's, you guys might have more impact on state government than our soils in the near future. Can you guys address that?
Yeah, be happy to. Can't say that I have a magic wand, not running for governor this year. But I can tell you that the Global Warming Solutions Act will require that every agency of state government get into alignment with our meeting our goals of greenhouse gas reduction. That would necessitate the Agency of Natural Resources to rethink whether it has a different way of evaluating small-scale hydro, for instance. And so that's why this priority of ours is so foundational to going where we need to go, because we first need to commit ourselves and our entire state government on our behalf to be focused on what the emergency is right now. Bill?
Yeah, my name is Bill from Dorset, and just want to jump on what Ryan was saying and press you a little bit more, because what policies is anybody even working on? I know there's a study being done, Kathleen, but when we hear all the talk about actions and everything, I hear nothing about agriculture. And sequestering carbon should be one of the priorities that we're working on. So are there policies that are actually being worked on, or is it just another study?
No, it's a great, do you want to jump in, or do you want me to?
You go ahead first.
Okay.
I'll add up.
Can you hear me okay, Bill? Yeah. So yeah, listen, I put a bill in a few years ago on regenerative soils. I do believe that the agricultural committees and agencies, if they were sitting right here, I would say this, they tend to be more conservative and maybe a little bit more slow-moving on some of these issues. But it's a big priority for me. I know it's something that we try to get through, but with little success. But perhaps with more of a groundswell, more support, perhaps reaching out to your own state rep and others to say that this is a big priority for you. Agriculture is a big issue on many fronts. We know that agriculture, different practices are also polluting our waters. We're trying to take steps to make those kinds of improvements, and I think we're having some luck. And so we also have the issue of dairies and dairies failing, and how do we help people transition out of that? People aren't drinking milk, they're not doing those kinds of things like they used to be in agricultural communities where there's heavy dairy. A lot of people aren't ready to pass, or the next generation isn't ready to take on the dairy. So Agricultural in general, I would agree, and I don't know if my colleagues would, but there has to be a lot of reform. And I'm hoping to get to the point where we can really incentivize people to do these kinds of no-till, regenerative soil practices that, again, help the soils, help all of us in terms of resiliency. And resiliency we haven't talked a lot about, but resiliency as these storms and issues continue to come. So I'm happy to try harder, but I think we need a greater lobbying and groundswell from people that want to see those changes and really talk and communicate with the agriculture community.
So that's in response to your question, Bill, I'm going to skip to another part of what I wanted to talk about tonight in the presentation, and that is the legislative branch of government is a part-time and completely unstaffed branch of government. And we are committed to finding ways to put ideas on the table that help us make progress. We can't do this without the cooperation and collaboration of the governor, because the governor is the person who has to direct the state agencies to, as Senator Campion said, not be so backwards thinking and actually, try to push forward on some of these newer ideas. We need the governor to be leading on this. We need him to be telling his ag agency, yes, I want you to make carbon sequestration a priority. We need him to be telling his A&R to be looking at new ways of promoting hydrogeneration. And so if you believe that we're in a climate emergency and you want to know when you leave here tonight what you should do to be a part of the solution, call the governor. Call him and say, what of your Climate Action Commission's 52 recommendations are you going to implement this year? Because you told us that we would meet our Paris climate goals, and you haven't put forward any proposals so far to help us do that. Bill has a follow-up question.
And I just want to follow up with exactly what you were just saying, Sarah, that the Governor's Climate Commission did make recommendations on forestry.
And how many of them have been implemented?
Exactly. So
yes.
when you have the gravitas of the commission behind you to be able to say, Governor, your Climate Commission made these recommendations, here's what we need to do. Yes. So I would say definitely hang on that.
And consider running for office, some people. Honestly, I'm not, but ask your reps, ask your senators, ask, people who are on your select board, where does this fall in terms of their priority? And if it's not a priority for them, I'll tell you, it's time for some real change.
My name is Jim, and I'm from East Dorset. I was recently traveling in Montana and reading a publication that the state of Montana was putting out, trying to help farmers in this western part of Montana with sort of the same, I'll call it money issues that our local farmers are having. And I'm reading the article, and it's talking about many of the things they're talking about and how to treat soils for carbon sequestration. Interestingly enough, they're receiving incentives from a company in Burlington, Vermont, called Native Energy, and my son did work for them for a year and a half. So if you're not aware of that, you might explore that to see if that can be brought home, not only for our farmers, but for Native Energy, a local company.
Yeah, it's great to know. Thanks, Jim.
We just had a big storm here, and a lot of people were out of power. And when you say that you want everyone to heat their houses and everything with electricity, you've got to realize that we're not going to make it that way when every time we have a storm, we're out of power. And we can't heat our homes, we can't cook, we can't do anything. So what about backup plans?
Backup plan is a Tesla Powerwall.
Yeah, I was going to say.
How many people here have a Tesla Powerwall in their house? Okay, so talk to your neighbors. Jim?
I'm Tony DuPont from Manchester, and Jeff and sort of other people have talked about the main driving force because you guys are here is because you think there's a national emergency surrounding carbon dioxide affecting the temperature. So I got a question basically to legislature people. Do you have any staff people or any scientific people to tell you how much energy it takes to make a solar cell or how much energy it takes to make a windmill compared to what you get out of it? Because as long as we're using silicon solar cells, it takes about 70% more energy to make one than you get out of it during its useful life. And I don't know the numbers for windmills, but there's a lot of steel, it takes a lot of coal to smelt, it takes a lot of concrete, there's a lot of fossil fuels used to make a windmill. And until you get that balance, you may be in a losing fight when you're promoting solar cells and windmills as a solution to climate change.
It's a fair question. I'm not going to let the perfect be the enemy of the good. We're going renewable energy.
Yeah, I would just add that I think we all should recognize that there is no, every energy source has a cost and an environmental cost along with it. And that's certainly true of solar cells, it would be true of windmills, it would be true of hydro. There is science, I believe, that shows that the cost of solar setup, including batteries, long-term storage batteries, which would be part of any long-term solution, that the environmental impact is far less for the solar than for the current fossil fuel setup that we have.
Jim.
So I get the microphone down, I can turn too. Thank you. A couple of good questions just recently, and from a planner's perspective, again, we do look a lot at the embedded energy cost of alternative fuel systems, and you're right, they're not free. There's no perfect solution when it comes to energy, especially, but we do find that they are a lot more energy efficient, and the net energy yields are actually improving and are not quite as dire as suggested. And on the concern about electricity and electrification of the heating system, there are some things to be concerned about, true, when it comes to electricity, but there's things to be concerned about when it comes to anything. You know, your oil boiler might not work quite so well when the electricity goes out either. But you should also look at other alternative heating systems, especially wood-based heating systems. And we'll be doing, hopefully, a program on residential wood heating alternatives in Manchester next month. And that's a very good alternative for a lot of people.
You should be sitting up here with all these good commercials you have.
One question I wanted to, or comment I wanted to make though, on transportation, especially in your potential PCI investments. Temptation very often is to talk about finding ways to reduce the fossil fuel use and getting from point A to point B. And a lot of times a better, well that's important, a better long-term cost-effective solution is to try to find ways to reduce the distance between points A and point B. And to do that, some funding is really needed to support public infrastructure in a lot of our village centers that don't have things like public water, wastewater systems, and it makes it very, very difficult to have that type of compact mixed-use development that is so energy efficient that lets people get to a lot of destinations, you know, with either very short drives or by walking. And I mean, certainly one of the better examples locally is right here in East Arlington, where there's a lot of interest in revitalizing this part of the community, but they're really hamstrung by a lack of infrastructure.
Good point.
Hi, my name's Loretta. Sorry for being late, so I hope I'm not asking a question that was already discussed. But one of my questions, and I'm still learning about what all ramifications and opportunities are available for alternative energy sources. But what in the exploration that my family has done regarding solar and electric vehicles, the incentives aren't always very helpful for all people. So in our case in particular, we're retired, but raising a family of teenagers. So tax credits don't really help us a whole heck of a lot. And some alternate ways of making the people that are in the least advantageous position to do some of these things from a financial perspective, it seems like they're the least advantages. That it's almost like you have to have it in order to be able to do it, in order to be able to get the rebates. You know, they always say, you have to have money in order to make money. Well, so what, if anything, when we talk about incentivizing, what, if anything, can be done along those lines? I mean, we heat with wood, we're in pretty good shape when we have a power out, and I'm still learning what other opportunities are available to us, but we've had a solar assessment, we've looked at electric vehicles, and I mean, the rebate for the electric vehicle is if you have a lease. Well, if you're a soccer mom and you live in Weston, you can't get around on an electric vehicle because you're going to use more mileage per year than a lease vehicle is going to. If you bought the vehicle, but the incentives aren't there for the things that are most cost effective.
Jim, do you want to take that one? No, but before Jim, because I'm sure he'll be able to comment, we did take, I don't have the details, but I'm happy to email them to you. We did start to take some steps to, again, get these incentives to more what people would consider to be modest Vermonters, most Vermonters. And the other piece that we're hoping is there does seem to be more and more of a used car market out there for electric and hybrids. So hopefully that will also start to help.
Well, we got a used hybrid. We just bought. We just bought a used hybrid. I've gone from the van that could take half the soccer team to a 5-passenger.
Yes.
But there was no incentive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Edward.
Thanks very much. I'm Edward. I'm from Ireland. I'm relatively newcomer to the area. I have a comment or two more than a question. The first part of my comment is I travel all over this region speaking about climate change. And what I notice wherever I go, North Adams, Bennington, Manchester, Brattleboro, Keene, everywhere I go in the region, this place has more than enough emergencies. It has unemployment emergencies, opiate emergencies, youth flight emergencies, deindustrialization emergencies. So you have got to stop talking about emergency and you've got to start talking about opportunity. Because the good news is when you create a low-carbon, climate-resilient, and inclusive economy, you expand the tax base, you create employment, you create resilient societies, you attract new businesses, you protect existing businesses, you give options to people. I don't hear very much of that messaging coming from all of you. And it really needs to get out there because I think in some of the skeptical questions you've had from people tonight, you can hear a reservoir of fear and a reservoir of pain in what it is they're asking. And someone like me could easily sit here and dismiss some of these skeptical comments, but they're representative of what genuine, ordinary people feel about this topic. So the good news is we have a great story to tell about the trillions of dollars that are being invested all around the world over the next decade to create a low-carbon economy, of the companies right around the world who are expanding and creating local employment opportunity. That story has to come out far more than is currently the case. The second comment I have is, please don't only learn from what has been happening elsewhere, because what has been happening elsewhere has failed. So what we need in this new approach is we need imagination. I've heard nothing about the State Attorney General and the role that that person has to play in ensuring that we do not roll back federal standards on vehicles. I've heard nothing about what that person can do to join lawsuits that will ensure that, for example, we don't undermine the Clean Power Plan in the CAFE standards. I've heard nothing about the role of public procurement and how that can send a real stimulus to the real economy. I've heard nothing about taxing the shit out of Amazon to make sure that they're not only sending high carbon products into our state, but at the same time undermining small business owners that we all depend upon for the integrity of our communities. So please, please, please try to think creatively and imaginatively about all of the things that we can do. Because the truth of the matter is, a state that is already 94% clean energy, that only has a population of 600,000 people, cannot contribute to decarbonisation globally unless you think big and think with imagination and contribute to what's going on elsewhere. And if you do those things, you can have a real impact. But if you don't, what you're going to get is pushback from people saying, I'm struggling with the bills, why are you asking me for more sacrifice? Thank you.
No, we have a few more minutes.
Don Keeling, I promised my wife I wouldn't say a word tonight.
Is she sitting next to you?
No. But a couple of comments. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for the working on this important issue. I agree with the gentleman. Has it risen to a level of a crisis in Vermont? I'm not quite sure of that. But just as an aside, before I make another point, we're all sitting next to, literally, what was a hydroelectric dam that was right outside this building over on the Peters Brook here, built by Ethan Allen's cousin in 1764. It was a hydroelectric dam until 1929. In 2000, my wife and I bought the property. She turned it into an antique center. Some of you may have known it as the old Cannonball Village. But we were looking at turning the hydro facility in the basement of the building into a hydroelectric. And then as a real estate developer, having processed dozens of cases through Act 250, I said there's no way in the world I'm going to go through these regulations to make that put that back online again, even though the technology was there to make it much easier. But I want to mention one thing. Last month, I interviewed Governor Scott on GNAT for an hour. At the end of the program, I asked him the last question. If you had only one thing to work on in Montpelier, what is it that you would work on? He said to try to bring young people into the state and keep them in the state. I didn't hear anything about climate or anything else, although we did discuss that during the show. But that was his most important priority. And as one of the founders of the Arlington Area Renewal Project, we have a lot of issues that people are concerned about in this area. One is housing, which we cannot even address. Why? Because of the cost. When the Shire's Housing is building housing in Shaftesbury and Bennington for $325,000 a unit, we cannot even touch that here. Secondly, you mentioned in the weatherization that you will get plumbers, electricians, and those involved who actually have to work on those issues. Guess what? They're not around here. Most of us in the real estate development business can't find laborers, can't find the tradespeople. Matter of fact, that's why it's so expensive to build here, because we're looking at building in Connecticut, it's a third the price because there's more of those trades available to us. And the other one is, of course, which we, I know sometimes we like to bury it, and that is the opiate issue. It's rampant, as we all know. Governor Shumlin spent the whole State of the Union on it several years ago, and it hasn't gotten really much better, other than the fact that we've got a lot more treatment centers for it. Right? But so the point is, when you really get down to it, what are the priorities that you and government should be working on? And I'm not discounting this climate issue. Right? It's something we need to work on. But the question is, where does it fit in the chain of priorities? Because right now, I'm going to assure you, here in southwestern Vermont, we have a lot of priority, we have a lot more serious issues than whether or not we should all go out and buy an electric car. That's not the issue right now. The issue is whether or not we're going to have a school, we're going to have some of the major employers here, and I'm not sure you're familiar with Bennington. We just lost Energizer, and just 2 years ago we lost Poisson. Why? They can't get employees. So you personally, some of you personally may, not just you up there, but may feel that the climate thing is a major crisis. We must get to it. Just like back in 2000 when we had Y2K, that was a crisis. And those of us of my generation, in the 1960s, you all had to go out and build a bomb shelter, which we did. I didn't, but the house I had one. So the point is, you know, where do we put the priorities, and how alarming do you want to be? Because I can tell you, if all you did up in Montpelier in January is to work on this issue, what happens to all these other issues that have not been addressed really yet and have not been solved? Thank you.
If I may just mention one thing to Don's point, I think he raises a lot of good points. I do think that there is a connection between bringing young people here and renewable energy. I do, I even see it at Bennington College. I see young people making their decisions around where they want to go to college, what food they want to buy, where they shop. A lot of those now are connected to renewable energy and agriculture and local. So I do think the more we do, we are going to continue to see an increase in terms of population. I also want to mention, we have started a little bit in this state to see people leave other states and come to the state of Vermont because they live in coastal areas that they feel are going to be or have already experienced severe damage. So the population issue, I just want to mention that as well. Okay.
I wanted to respond as well just a little bit. Don, every issue you raised is vital, and I think we all know that those are all incredibly important issues that affect our local communities all over Vermont and here as well. And the one thing I often say to people when they ask, well, why is the legislature working on this when you should be working on that? Or why are you doing X when you should be doing Y? Is that the legislature can and does work on many critical issues all at the same time because there are so many of us and we have so many committees, and tonight's point is to talk about climate action, why it matters, and what we're planning to do about it. So this was not a forum about everything that the legislature and the executive branch could and should be doing simultaneously, because we are capable of working on many things at the same time. So tonight we're here to talk about climate. I want to echo what Brian said, which is that Vermont has an opportunity to lead on this. And when you talk to young people, let me tell you, the thing that young people care about more than any other issue is climate. They're scared not only because of the climate emergency, but because they see the older generation often being afraid and unwilling to act. That is more scary to them than anything else. The thought that we are not willing and ready to stand up and try to help save this planet for them. So if Vermont becomes a state that leads on climate, that is known as a state with a rapid and aggressive transition to a low carbon economy, those are jobs, that's workforce training, those are skills. I can promise you that will do a great deal to attract young people to move here if they think that Vermont is a state that takes climate seriously, that puts its money where its mouth is, and that takes action. That is what the young people of this country want us to be doing.
Anne DeLevo from Manchester. I was going to start saying exactly what Brian and Kathleen just said, so thank you for saying that. I think also, I always think of the climate crisis as a global humanitarian crisis. You can't just think about this country, you can't just think about the state, our own town, we've got to think globally. You've got to look outside what is going on in other countries. The Pacific Islands are basically drowning. They will. I mean, there's no doubt about it. I think that that's going to happen. We've got almost too far, unfortunately, for the people who live in the Pacific Islands. They only live a meter above sea level, and they've already lost a lot of their land. You know, you've got to look at pollution in China and India and what's happening there. And I also wanted to say, I'm a European, I'm British, I'm English, and I think we should look at what is happening in Europe and how far they are progressing in this. I think America will get left behind if we don't keep up with what's going on in the rest of the world as far as technology and green energy. So that was just a statement, not a question. I also wanted to bring up about public transportation. I liked exactly what you said about EVs and public transit, but nothing was mentioned about trains. We have a train system in Vermont, but we have rail tracks which are perfectly good, which are being used for goods and not passenger services. And we see that in Manchester. Whenever I hear the train hooting from my house, and if I'm driving alongside the railroad lines, I'm thinking, why are they just being used for goods and not for passenger service? Having come from Britain, we had a great public transportation system, trains and buses. In fact, to the point where I never really thought about it much at all until I came to this country, thinking, well, why don't they have a public transportation system here? This is a rural state. It just makes sense to have one. I know this has been brought up before, but I think that this is the time to do it because it will be less carbon emissions, for one thing. We are having more extreme weather events now, such as Hurricane Irene, where people were cut off because of the flooding. They couldn't get out of their own town. If we had trains running, trains can basically get through those floods most of the time. But if there were repairs to be needed, it would be easier to repair the railroad lines than the roads. You were talking about infrastructure for villages, for roads around villages. I think Jim was saying that, I'm not sure. But you could actually increase infrastructure through the railroad system with public buses going between the railroad stations, which is exactly what we have in Britain. Not every village has a train coming to their village, but we have public buses going between. There's new train technology now. I believe that there are solar-powered trains, I think, in Europe. I'm not an expert. And with the rising cost of fossil fuels for cars and for planes, trains make a more attractive option now than it used to because of the price of oil going up. I'd like to say to look at Europe as a model. It's not perfect, but I think that we need to update the system here. We've already got a decent system as far as going from city to city, but I think we need it more in places like Vermont and other rural places. And also the historic nature of railway lines, the businesses thrive along railroad lines. So that is a way of getting more jobs in Vermont. The last thing I want to say, and this has been in the Bennington Banner and the Manchester Journal just this last week, the fact that oil and gas are stored in tanks on the railroad lines right by residential areas. Danby is one, Bennington is another. And that is a huge, huge hazard. People will be, if there's an explosion, you know, that would be just a horrific accident, and it could so easily happen. We should get rid of those tanks off the railroad lines and use the railroad lines the way they should be used. Thank you.
If I may just say something about the tankers, because we've been involved with this down in Bennington. There are federal preemption laws, so I mean, one of the things I would encourage you to do is to reach out to our federal delegation. The state's hands are tied on this issue. but I would suggest you reach out to our senators and Congressman Welch. Please. Thanks.
Last one.
Well, I really want to thank you for organizing on climate and for getting us out here tonight. Reminds me of the phrase, no good deed goes unpunished. Been handling a lot of tough questions. I feel like you missed the issue of public ownership of utilities. Green Mountain Power and Delco and the Town Energy Committee arrangement has been trying to get us towards a zero carbon economy for however long and not succeeded. I would ask you to consider including in your plans Vermont taking ownership of a democratic, distributed solar economy for local communities. The issue about the New England grid, recently there was a protest in Bow, New Hampshire at a coal-fired power plant, and some of Vermont's power comes from a coal plant still. And the issue of pulling Vermont out of the New England grid arrangement is at least one thing we could do to establish some energy sovereignty. And finally, Vermont Gas Pipeline was built through the cooperation with the state. It is partially a state-owned utility. The pipeline has showed a lot of problems, as well as natural gas not being a good, it's not a solution to the climate crisis. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on the pipeline.
So I thank you for bringing up those ideas. Energy independence is what we've been talking about, but I like the phrase energy sovereignty. That's a different way of looking at it. With respect to pipeline, the Climate Solutions Caucus does not believe that continuing to invest in distribution infrastructure for fossil fuels makes sense. We are not at this moment pushing the idea of a ban on fossil fuel infrastructure because we believe that it is more important and will have a bigger impact if we simply get our accountability, our Global Warming Solutions Act in place. That will necessitate a conversation in future years about fossil fuel infrastructure. So thank you for bringing that up. And thank you all for coming, and I'm going to give the mic to Kathleen so that she can wrap up, but I will be hanging out for a while before I hit the road, so if I didn't answer your question, feel free to come and grab me afterward.
Thank you all so much for coming. We did have a sign-up sheet in the lobby. If you'd like to be on the Climate Solutions Caucus mailing list, please make sure that you sign up before you go. We had a couple of handouts back there as well if you'd like to take one. And I see a fellow who just has a burning...
No, it's not a question, it's real quick. My name is Jeff Dexter. We're starting a committee in Sunderland, so if there's anyone from Sunderland who would like to be on the Energy Committee, please send me out.
Thank you. Did everybody hear Jeff?
My name is Stephanie Moffett-Hines. I'm the chair of the Arlington Energy Committee, and we have a wonderful, cheerful group. If you want to join us, we welcome anybody to come. Bring your energy to us, and we'll energize our town. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here. It is a great opportunity that Sara is here, so if you have specific questions, here she is. Thank you all for coming.